false accusations. They're more common than you might imagine. And the chances are, we all here this morning have been the victim of a false accusation at one point in time. And listen, if you've suffered from the effects that come from these false accusations, then I assure you that you're not alone. As a matter of fact, according to one study, 10,000 people in the United States may be wrongfully convicted of serious crimes each and every year. 10,000 people a year accused and even convicted of a serious crime. As a result, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of people who have been placed in prison simply because of a false accusation. And while this indeed is a huge number, it's also a number that doesn't even take into consideration all of the people who have lost their job or ended up divorced or even diminished in the eyes of their community simply because someone decided to lodge a false accusation against them. Well, here in our study this morning, we're going to consider the bad fruit of false accusations. And as we explore the false accusations that are found in our text today, we're going to see, number one, how false accusations distort reality. Secondly, this morning, we'll see how false accusations damage reputations. Thirdly, this morning, we'll see how false accusations destroy families. And finally, today, we'll see how false accusations distress the accused. Well, with this as our outline, let's open our Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 22. And I want to consider the fruit of false accusations. As you open your Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 22, I want to set the stage for our study today. I want to remind you that Saul, the king of Israel, he had become insanely jealous of a young Israelite boy named David. You see, it was clear to Saul that the Lord was raising up David to become the next king of Israel. Rather than submitting to the Lord's perfect will, Saul sought to rid himself of this threat by killing David. But now we should remember here that David, he was loved by the nation of Israel. He was a war hero, having killed the giant named Goliath. And as a result, Saul decided to spread some false accusations in order to get the public opinion on his side. He wanted to sway the opinion of those who loved David so much, so that he would find it much more easier to go out and find David and kill him. So he began to lodge these false accusations. And with this in mind, let's continue our study of 1 Samuel chapter 22. I want to begin there at verse 6. There we learn that when Saul heard that David and the men who were with him had been discovered, now Saul was staying in Gibeah under a tamarisk tree in Ramah, with his spear in his hand, and all his servants standing about him. Then Saul said to his servants who stood about him, "Hear now, you Benjamites. Will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards, and make you all captains of thousands and captains of hundreds? All of you have conspired against me, and there is no one who reveals to me that my son has made a covenant with the son of Jesse, and there is not one of you who is sorry for me or reveals to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait as it is this day." Then answered Doeg the Edomite, who was set over the servants of Saul, and said, "I saw the son of Jesse going to Nob to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub. And he inquired of the Lord for him, gave him provisions, and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. So the king sent to Ahimelech, the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all his father's house, the priests who were at Nob. And they all came to the king. And Saul said, "Hear now, son of Ahitub." He answered, "Here I am, my lord." Then Saul said to him, "Why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, in that you have given him bread and a sword, and have inquired of God for him, that he should rise against me, to lie in wait, as it is this day?" So Ahimelech answered the king and said, "And who among all your servants is as faithful as David, who is the king's son-in-law, who goes at your bidding, and is honorable in your house? Did I then begin to inquire of God for him? Far be it from me. Let not the king impute anything to his servant or to any in the house of my father, for your servant knew nothing of all this, little or much." And the king said, "You shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and all your father's house." Then the king said to the guards who stood about him, "Turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because their hand also is with David."
because they knew when he fled and did not tell it to me. But the servants of the king would not lift their hands to strike the priests of the Lord. And the king said to Doeg, you turn and kill the priests. So Doeg the Edomite turned and struck the priests and killed on that day 85 men who wore a linen ephod. Also, Nob, the city of the priests, he struck with the edge of the sword both men and women, children and nursing infants, oxen and donkeys and sheep, with the edge of the sword. Now one of the sons of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, he escaped and fled after David. And Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the Lord's priests. So David said to Abiathar, I knew that day, when Doeg the Edomite was there, that he would surely tell Saul, I have caused the death of all the persons of your father's house. Stay with me, do not fear, for he who seeks my life seeks your life, but with me you shall be safe. Well, here in these verses we find King Saul. He's hanging out there in the Benjamite city of Gibeah, and he was plotting his next move to capture and kill David. And while he himself was from the tribe of Benjamin, it's obvious to me that he felt like the people from his own tribe, well, they weren't really on his side. They weren't really standing with him. And in order to persuade the Benjamites to help him to find and kill David, Saul attempted to convince them that David wouldn't show them the same favor that he had shown them. Notice again there in verse 7. There Saul said to his servants who stood about him, hear now, you Benjamites. He's talking to his people from his tribe. He asks, will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards and make you all captains of thousands and captains of hundreds? Well, here in this first accusation, Saul was setting out to remind the Benjamites that they had been the ones who had been receiving kingly favor, and for no other reason than because they were all Benjamites. Therefore, they had been given fields, they had been given vineyards, and Saul had made them captains in the military. They had been made captains over thousands and captains over hundreds, simply because they were Benjamites. With this reminder came a veiled accusation that David, being the son of Jesse, he wouldn't show them the same favor that he had shown them because, well, David was from the tribe of Judah. He was presenting this veiled accusation as if to say that, well, David's going to come along and he's going to give favor to all of the people from the tribe of Judah and not from the people of the tribe of Benjamin. And so Saul was attempting to convince the Benjamites, hey, help me find David and kill him, and you're actually helping yourself. Well, then after falsely accusing David of being a man who would be an unfit person to be king, an unfair king, so to speak, Saul continued his false accusations by pointing his finger at his own Benjamite servants. Notice again there at verse 8. There Saul declares, all of you have conspired against me, and there is no one who reveals to me that my son has made a covenant with the son of Jesse, and there is not one of you who is sorry for me, or reveals to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait, as it is this day. Now, doesn't your heart just go out to this crybaby? Oh, no one's standing with you. Well, he's doing things that are unjust. He was wrong. And he's crying about it because no one's standing on his side. But here in this verse, we find Saul, he's accusing the Benjamites of actually conspiring against him. Not only that they weren't standing with him, but they were conspiring against him. And it'll help us to understand that the word conspire, it refers to those who join together against another. And according to Saul's conspiracy theory here, the Benjamites had joined together with his son Jonathan so that together they might protect David from the jealous wrath of the king. Well, not only was Saul falsely accusing the Benjamites of conspiring against him, but he was also falsely accusing David of actually being out there somewhere, lying in wait to take his life. Notice again with me there in the middle of verse 8. There Saul declares, there is not one of you who is sorry for me or reveals to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait, as it is this day. Well, here in this verse, we find Saul, he's falsely accusing his son Jonathan of stirring up David to lie in wait. And it'll help us to understand that this phrase, lie in wait, it speaks of setting an ambush with the intent of a surprise attack. Therefore, Saul was not only falsely accusing Jonathan of initiating and instigating this attack, but he was also falsely accusing David of being out there attempting to ambush him somewhere so that he might kill Saul and take his throne. And so in Saul's mind, he's thinking, yeah, David's out there. The Benjamites are against me. Jonathan's against me. And they've all conspired together to have David out there somewhere, and he's going to come out of a bush, or he's going to be somewhere hiding, and he's going to get me, and he's going to kill me, and all you guys are in on this conspiracy. Well, as we consider all of these accusations that were made by King Saul, I should take a moment to point out how each of these accusations were nothing more than a distortion of reality. For example, when Saul told the Benjamites that David would be an unfit king because he wouldn't show favoritism to the tribe of Benjamin, the reality is David would be a more fit king because he wouldn't show favoritism to any of the tribes. You see, Saul was the unfit king because he was actually showing favoritism to one tribe over another. But David would come along and he wouldn't show favoritism to any of the tribes. Therefore, he would be more fair than Saul was. From this, we see that Saul's first accusation was nothing more than a distortion of reality, and it really only exposed his own unfitness to be king. And when Saul accused the Benjamites of conspiring against him by helping Jonathan to make a covenant with David, the reality is that Jonathan and David were the only ones who knew about their covenants. Even that little servant boy who came out and chased the arrow, he didn't know anything about what was going on with that covenant between Jonathan and David. And so Saul's second accusation, again, was nothing more than a distortion of reality. And when Saul accused Jonathan and David of setting an ambush against him, the fact is, David was on the run. And as we've seen in the previous text, well, he was hiding in different places in an attempt to avoid King Saul. He wasn't hiding in a bush somewhere. He wasn't waiting and lying in wait to take Saul's life. No, he was running for his life. So again, Saul's accusations were nothing more than a distortion of reality. And in order to understand how false accusations are always distortions of reality, if you would hold your place here in 1 Samuel and turn with me to John chapter 8. John chapter 8. As you turn to John chapter 8, I should point out that truth is that which corresponds to reality. This is what we call the correspondence theory of truth. And what this simply means is that truth is any statement which clearly reflects the facts as they are. Based on this concept of the correspondence of truth, we should conclude here that whatever is a distortion of the facts would be considered untrue or false. So anything that is a distortion of reality, well, that is what is untrue. Therefore, a false accusation, well, it's nothing more than a distortion of reality. And listen, anything that distorts reality, well, it's not from God, but instead it's from the devil. With this in mind, if you would, look with me there at John chapter 8. I want to begin reading at verse 31. There John tells us, Jesus said to those Jews who believed him, "If you abide in my word, you are my disciples indeed, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." They answered him, "We are Abraham's descendants and have never been in bondage to anyone. How can you say you will be made free?" Jesus answered them, "Most assuredly I say to you, whoever commits sin is a slave of sin, and a slave does not abide in the house forever, but a son abides forever. Therefore, if the Son makes you free, you shall be free indeed. I know that you are Abraham's descendants, but you seek to kill me because my word has no place in you. I speak what I have seen with my father, and you do what you have seen with your father." They answered and said to him, "Abraham is our father." Jesus said to them, "If you were Abraham's children, you would do the works of Abraham. But now you seek to kill me, a man who has told you the truth, which I heard from God. Abraham did not do this. You do the deeds of your father." Then they said to him, "We were not born of fornication. We have one Father, God." Jesus said to them, "If God were your Father, you would love me. For I proceeded forth and came from God, nor have I come of myself, but he sent me. Why do you not understand my speech? Because you are not able to listen to my word. You are of your father, the devil, and the desires of your father you want to do. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own resources, for he is a liar and the father of it." Here in these verses, Jesus helps us to understand that those who receive his word will be set free by the truth, while those who practice deceit, well, they're in league with their father, the devil. Because listen, Satan is a liar, and he is the father of all lies. Now, it'll help us to understand that this title, devil, that Jesus gives to Satan here, the word devil comes from the Greek word diabolos, which literally means slanderer or false accuser. The word devil means false accuser. And so the devil is the one who falsely accuses us before God night and day. And listen, since the devil is the father of every false accusation, then it only stands to reason that those who engage in false accusations are following in the footsteps of Satan, which means that we're distorting the reality of God's truth, just like the devil does. And you better believe that the devil and his demons are out there whispering these false accusations into the ear of any person that will listen. And when a person then decides to repeat those false accusations, all they're doing is the work of the devil. Therefore, we must be careful to avoid making false accusations. Because listen, false accusations are a work of the devil because they distort reality and keep people from the truth. Not only that, but false accusations, they also damage reputations. Now, with this in mind, let's turn back to 1 Samuel chapter 22. Because there we see how false accusations ended up defaming the good reputation of the priest who actually helped David. With this in mind, if you would look with me there at verse 9. There we read that Doeg then answered Doeg the Edomite, who was set over the servants of Saul, and said, I saw the son of Jesse going to Nob to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub. And he inquired of the Lord for him, gave him provisions, and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. So the king sent to call Ahimelech the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all his father's house, the priests who were in Nob. And they all came to the king. And Saul said, Hear now, son of Ahitub. He answered, Here I am, my lord. Then Saul said to him, Why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, in that you have given him bread and a sword, and have inquired of God for him that he should rise against me to lie in wait, as it is this day? Well, here in these verses, we find Doeg the Edomite. He's responding to the false accusations that were made by King Saul. And he probably saw this as an opportunity to move up in the ranks of the kingdom. And so he stepped forward in order to inform Saul about the help that David had received from a priest in the city of Nob. Now, it's true that David had gone to this priestly city of Nob. He had sought help from that priest named Ahimelech. And while most of the information that Doeg presented to Saul was true, he did end up presenting a false accusation by implying that Ahimelech knew that David was actually on the run from King Saul. As a matter of fact, look again there at verse 10. There Doeg told Saul that Ahimelech inquired of the Lord for him, gave him provisions, and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. Now, consider here that it's true that Ahimelech had given David the provision of bread and the sword of Goliath. However, when Doeg told Saul that the priest had inquired of the Lord for him, he was actually suggesting here that Ahimelech was asking the Lord to help David overthrow the kingdom of Saul. As a result, Doeg's false accusation, well, it was defaming the reputation of Ahimelech. This false accusation was damaging Ahimelech's reputation. And rather than asking Ahimelech for his side of the story, Saul believed the false accusation of Doeg. And so he sent for Ahimelech so that he might accuse him to his face. Notice again there in verse 13. There Saul said to Ahimelech, Why have you conspired against me? Now, the real question might be here, Ahimelech, why did, or I should say, did you conspire against me? This would be the opportunity for Saul to allow Ahimelech to speak for himself, to listen to Ahimelech's side of the story, and get his version of the facts so that he might weigh the testimony of Doeg against Ahimelech. I mean, we are talking about an Edomite shepherd versus the testimony of a priest of Israel. But he didn't want to hear Ahimelech's side of the story. He simply took the false accusation and put it before Ahimelech and said, why have you done this? Why have you conspired against me? He says, why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, in that you have given him bread and a sword, and have inquired of God for him, that he should rise against me to lie in wait, as it is this day? Now here in this verse we find Saul, he's interrogating Ahimelech. He's interrogating about his involvement in David's mutiny. And he's asking Ahimelech why he sought the Lord's help. Why did you go before God and pray that God would help David to lie in wait and ambush him? Now, I'll remind you that Ahimelech had done no such thing. Remember, when David arrived at Nob, he told the priest that he had been sent by the king on official business. This was David's lie, as we saw. And so Ahimelech here, he thought he was obeying the king by giving David provisions and a sword. However, because of Doeg's false accusation here, Ahimelech's reputation was now damaged in the eyes of Saul. And as a result of this lie, Saul truly believed that Ahimelech was in on the whole conspiracy. That he was on David's side. He was helping David to take away the throne from him. From this situation, we should take a moment to consider how every false accusation ends up damaging another person's good reputation. Just like this false accusation damaged the reputation of Ahimelech in the eyes of Saul. Now, in order to further consider this point, if you would, hold your place here in 1 Samuel and turn with me to Proverbs chapter 25. As you turn to Proverbs 25, we should take a moment to consider how false accusations oftentimes include bits of truthful facts. It's not that false accusations are entirely false. The best false accusations always have tidbits of truth within them. For example, Doeg's false accusation, it included two truthful facts, which led him to one faulty assumption, resulting in the false accusation. Remember, Doeg saw Ahimelech give David provisions. He gave him the old showbread, and the sword of Goliath. Then after he heard the false accusation that was presented by Saul, he assumed that the priest must have been helping David, which led him to present a false accusation of his own, resulting in the damaged reputation of Ahimelech. Now, in light of this story, excuse me, I can't help but to wonder how many times we've been guilty. Pardon me. I just wonder how many times we've been guilty of making false accusations in the same exact way. It's not that we set out to lie. It's not that we set out to just tell a big fib about someone. But we saw a few things. We saw a few truthful facts, and then we used them to jump to a wrong conclusion. We saw a few things, and it got us thinking, well, if that's true and that's true, well then clearly this other thing that I just imagined must also be true. Then whenever we decide to present those facts mixed with our faulty conclusion, we're actually broadcasting a false accusation to those who receive our testimony. As we do, we're actually damaging the reputation of the person that we're talking about. And this is exactly what Solomon was writing about here in Proverbs chapter 25. As a matter of fact, look with me there. I want to begin at verse 18 because there Solomon declares, "A man who bears false witness against his neighbor is like a club, a sword, and a sharp arrow." Now here in this verse, Solomon helps us to see that the person who spreads a false accusation is like a club. Now it'll help us to understand that this word for club, it's a word that speaks of the sort of weapon that would be used to disperse a crowd or maybe even shatter a rock into pieces. And so this club, it's being used to imply damage here. Not only that, but Solomon also likened the person who spreads a false accusation to a sword. And from this we see then that a false accusation, it not only crushes the person being falsely accused like a club would, but it's also like a sword, which, in other words, cuts the person to the very core of their being. And so a false accusation, it clubs a person and crushes them. It also cuts them to the core. And finally, Solomon also likens the person who spreads a false accusation to an arrow. From this, we see that a false accusation is something that will pierce the heart of the person that's being accused, like an arrow is able to pierce the heart of its prey. Now, as we consider these three analogies here, we discover that a false accusation can only damage the person who is being falsely accused. And if nothing else, it damages the reputation of the person being accused. From this, we must understand that we have to avoid taking those little tidbits of fact, jumping to the wrong conclusion, and then broadcasting a false accusation, because all it's going to do is bear bad fruit. It's going to damage the reputation of the person that we're accusing. From this, we see then that false accusations, they distort reality, and false accusations, they damage reputations. And not only that, but false accusations also destroy families. Now, with this in mind, let's turn back to 1 Samuel chapter 22. I want to begin reading there at verse 13, because there we find Saul asking Ahimelech, "Why have you conspired against me, and you and the son of Jesse, and that you have given him bread and a sword, and have inquired of God for him, that he should rise against me to lie in wait as it is this day?" So Ahimelech answered the king and said, "And who among all your servants is as faithful as David? Who is the king's son-in-law, who goes at your bidding and is honorable in your house? Did I then begin to inquire of God for him? Far be it from me. Let not the king impute anything to his servant, or to any in the house of my father, for your servant knew nothing of all this, little or much." Ahimelech saying, hey, look, I didn't have any clue about this whole situation. I didn't know a little bit, I didn't know a lot, I didn't know a thing about it. And so don't impute this accusation to me, or don't credit this to my account. I didn't do what you think I did. Verse 17, then the king said to the guards who stood about him, "Turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because their hand is also with David. And because they knew when he fled and did not tell it to me, but the servants of the king would not lift their hands to strike the priests of the Lord." And the king said to Doeg, "You turn and kill the priests." So Doeg the Edomite turned and struck the priests and killed on that day 85 men who wore the linen ephod. Also Nob, the city of the priests, he struck with the edge of the sword both men and women, children and nursing infants, oxen and donkeys and sheep, with the edge of the sword. Now here in these verses we find Saul, he's accusing Ahimelech of conspiring against him with the son of Jesse, as we've already seen. And it should have been obvious from his response that Ahimelech, he knew nothing about this conspiracy. And we saw there in verse 14, he's saying, hey, look, who among all of your servants is as faithful as David? He's saying, look, you know, David shows up, and he's the most faithful guy in your house. He's the most faithful servant that you've ever seen. Why would I assume that he was doing something wrong? In the mind of Ahimelech, he was only doing what the king had commanded. And there in verse 15, Ahimelech continues to defend himself by declaring, "Did I then begin to inquire of God for him? Far be it from me." Or in other words, he's saying, look, I didn't ask God to help David overthrow your throne. That wasn't what I prayed. That prayer never came out of my mouth. Ahimelech was respectfully attempting to tell the king, look, Saul, you're wrong. And he couldn't just come right out and say, hey, king, you're wrong. He's the king. And so he's respectfully trying to say, hey, look, you might not have all the facts straight here. Your servant knew nothing of this, little or much. Unfortunately for Ahimelech, Saul didn't believe him, but rather believed the faulty report of Doeg the Edomite. And as a result, Doeg's false accusation resulted in the complete annihilation of Ahimelech's family. As a matter of fact, look again there at verse 16, where the king said, "You shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and all your father's house." Here in this declaration of destruction, Saul was promising to destroy the entire household of Ahimelech. And in order to convince the men of Israel to carry out this heinous atrocity, Saul presented the people with yet another false accusation against all the priests of the city of Nob. Notice again there at verse 17. We find Saul's false accusation there. Saul declares, "Turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because their hand also is with David, and because they knew when he fled and did not tell it to me." Now here in this verse, Saul was not only accusing Ahimelech of conspiring against him with David, but he's now accusing all of the priests there in Nob of conspiring against him with David. And yet, regardless of these accusations, the servants of the king, they weren't going to go through with this. They were unwilling to lift their sword against these priests, and rightfully so. But that's when Doeg the Edomite saw the opportunity for promotion. He stepped forward. He said, I'll take care of this. Notice again there at verse 18. There the king said to Doeg, you turn and kill the priests. So Doeg the Edomite turned and struck the priests and killed on that day 85 men who wore a linen ephod. Here in this verse we see how a false accusation ended up causing the death of 85 priests there in the city of Nob. And not only the priests, but there in verse 19 we also learn that Doeg struck both men and women, children and nursing infants, oxen and donkeys and sheep with the edge of the sword. Now as we read these shocking verses, we aren't told how many people died that day in the city of Nob. But what we are certain of is that this was one of the most horrific tragedies that this small city had ever seen. Well, the first question that we might ask is, why in the world would God allow this to happen to these people? Why would God allow these women to die? Why would God allow these children to die in this way? Now, it's true that God is sovereign. God could have overridden their decision. God could have stopped Doeg and his men from killing these people. But then I'll remind you that these were the same people who had asked for a king to rule over them, just like the kings of the Gentile world. And God could have overridden that decision too. But you see, God doesn't make it his business to oftentimes step in the way of our bad decisions. God isn't the sort of sovereign God who comes along and says, well, you're about to make a decision that's against my will, so let me go ahead and stop you before the consequences come. He doesn't do that, because then we wouldn't have free will. And without free will, then how would we truly love God? Our love would be nothing more than a forced love, which is not love at all. And so God gives us free will. He allows us to make decisions, both good and bad. And he allowed these people to choose for themselves a king who would rule over them just like the Gentile kings did. And here's Saul acting just like the Gentile kings acted. It's what they asked for. And it's unfortunate, and it's sad, and it's a tragedy. But God gives us the free will to choose to walk in his will or to walk contrary to his will. And what this also means is that he also allows us to enjoy the benefits of walking in his will, as well as suffer the consequences of not walking in his will. Well, in light of this fact, we must also remember that God has given us the free will to choose. And that means that we get to enjoy the benefits of walking in his will when we walk in obedience. But it also means that he allows us to suffer the consequences of the decisions that we make, which are contrary to God's will. And so when horrible things happen in our lives, and we can trace them back to sinful decisions that we've made, we can't say, why God, please get me out of this. But we simply have to say, well, I sowed the bad seed, and now I'm reaping the rotten fruit. Now I could easily spend the rest of our time today talking about the concept of sowing and reaping, the concept of reciprocity. But that's not what our study is about this morning. The point that I really want to focus on here is how false accusations ended up destroying an entire family. If you would, let's hold our place here in 1 Samuel 22 and continue to consider what I'm talking about here from Ephesians chapter 4. As you turn to Ephesians 4, I should point out that false accusations will not only destroy a natural family like it destroyed Ahimelech's family, but false accusations, they can also destroy a spiritual family like our family here at Calvary South Austin. The fact is, there have been many church families which have been completely destroyed simply because a false accusation was uttered and entertained and then repeated by careless Christians. Many churches destroyed simply because someone decided to spread a false accusation, and that false accusation just made its way around the church until the whole body just broke apart and divided, and the fellowship was destroyed. This is exactly what Paul was warning us about here in Ephesians chapter 4. With this in mind, look with me there at verse 25. Paul says, "Therefore, putting away lying, let each one of you speak truth with his neighbor, for we are members of one another." Here in this verse, Paul encourages us to stop lying to one another because we're now members of one another. We've become a family here in this church. And since a false accusation is a form of lying, Paul certainly means to tell us that those who are members of Christ's family must stop destroying their family with false accusations. You see, the false accusation of Doeg and Saul ended up destroying the entire family of Ahimelech. And while not in the same exact way, but with similar results, false accusations that happen in the church can destroy a church family. But now the problem with false accusations is this. It's based on the fact that we don't always know that the accusation is false. Sometimes we spread information around thinking that it's a true accusation when in fact it really is a false accusation. And so while a false accusation is a lie, it's a lie that we don't always know that we're telling. Sometimes we think that what we're telling is truth when in fact it's a lie. Well, in order to solve this problem, if you would, continue holding your place there at 1 Samuel 22 and turn with me to 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. It's 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. You see, it's in 1 Thessalonians 5 that Paul helps us to understand how we can avoid receiving and then repeating the false accusations that are made by the people around us. You see, once a false accusation is put out there, we have the option to receive it or not. And then once we receive it, we have the opportunity to repeat it or not. But before we receive it, Paul encourages us to test it, to find out if it's a true accusation or if it's a false accusation. With this in mind, look with me there at 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. I want to look at verse 19 because there Paul encourages us to avoid receiving an accusation against an elder except from 2 or 3 witnesses. Now here in this verse, Paul is encouraging us to reject any accusation that's made against a church leader unless there's more than one eyewitness who's actually reporting the same thing. The accusation needs to be backed up by another eyewitness or another 2 eyewitnesses. And the reason why is because any person can create a false accusation. Any person can say anything they want. It's easy to make up a story about another person. And so if one person comes to you and says, "Oh, you know what? You know what so-and-so did?" Well, just because one person comes to you and tells you that somebody did something, it doesn't make it true. And you know what? You might think that this person has all the integrity in the world and that they would never lie to you. And maybe they don't know they're lying. Maybe they received a false accusation and they didn't double check it. And so just because one person comes to you and tells you something, it doesn't make it true. And it's sad to say that we are so gullible here in this day and age. I can't even tell you how many emails I get that are nothing more than an internet scam or a lie that somebody is promoting out there, and I just go to Snopes.com or I go to one of the myth-busting websites out there and I look up the email and I find out that no, this is nothing more than a false accusation or something that is being spread around Facebook or the internet or whatever. So I have to contact that person and say, "Hey, you're spreading something that's false. That child really isn't missing. That person really didn't do that thing. This person really isn't dying of cancer. They're just scamming money." But we just spread this stuff around and, forward to everyone on my email list without even checking it out. Shame on us for being so gullible. Paul tells us here, make sure that the accusation comes from at least 2 or 3 eyewitnesses before you decide to pass on the information. And listen, this principle not only applies to leaders in our church, but it should apply to every single one of us. This should apply to every single person. It doesn't matter if someone comes and tells you something about Pastor Bunjee or one of our lead deacons or just the person sitting in the chair next to you. If someone brings you an accusation, don't believe it right off the bat. Make sure that you hear the story from another person before you give any credibility to it. And in this way, we can avoid destroying our church family by spreading around these false accusations. And so we see then that false accusations, they distort reality, they damage reputations, and they destroy families. But finally, we should consider how false accusations also distress the accused. And with this in mind, let's turn back to 1 Samuel chapter 22, because there we see how false accusations ended up completely distressing Ahimelech's family. I want to begin reading there at verse 20, because there one of the sons of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, he escaped and fled after David. And Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the Lord's priests. And so David said to Abiathar, I knew that day when Doeg the Edomite was there, that he would surely tell Saul, I have caused the death of all the persons of your father's house. Stay with me. Do not fear, for he who seeks my life seeks your life. But with me you shall be safe. Here in these verses we see how the false accusations of Saul and Doeg had not only resulted in the murder of many innocent people, but it also resulted in the distress of the sole survivor of Nob, whose name was Abiathar. Now, we aren't told how he managed to escape this horrific slaughter, but what we do know is that he fled and found David and told him that Saul had killed his entire family. From this we can see how a false accusation ended up causing major emotional distress in the life of this priest. And not only was Abiathar completely distressed about this situation, but so was David. As a matter of fact, look again there at verse 22, where David said to Abiathar, I knew that day when Doeg the Edomite was there, that he would surely tell Saul, I have caused the death of all the persons of your father's house. Now, as we read the words of David here, I can only imagine how bad he felt. Imagine living with this, knowing that you had lied to a priest, and as a result, false accusations were spread, resulting in the death of that entire family. Imagine the emotional distress that you would have to deal with in knowing that you created the conditions for this horrific event. You see, David didn't actually order the death of Ahimelech's family, but his deceptive actions created the conditions for the false accusation, which resulted in the massacre. And while it's true that David's lie created the conditions of this tragedy, we must also remember that it was the false accusation of Doeg that caused the destruction of Ahimelech's family. And it was the false accusation of Saul that had caused the distress in the lives of Abiathar and David. Now, in order to further grasp the depth of distress that David was experiencing, if you would, turn with me to Psalms chapter 52. You see, it's in Psalm 52 that we find David. He's pouring out his heart in a poetic way, and he's writing about this situation that we're actually reading about here in our text. And as he described this situation, we see how false accusations actually bring distress into the life of the one who's being falsely accused. Now, with this in mind, I want to look there at Psalm 52. Let's begin reading there at verse 1. There we learn that this psalm is actually a contemplation of David when Doeg the Edomite went and told Saul and said to him, David has gone to the house of Ahimelech. And then he begins to ask, as if Doeg were actually there, why do you boast in evil, O mighty man? The goodness of God endures continually. Your tongue devises destruction like a sharp razor working deceitfully. You love evil more than good, lying rather than speaking righteousness. Selah. You love all devouring words, you deceitful tongue. Now let's stop there and consider how here in these verses, David helps us to see that the tongue that spreads a false accusation, it ends up causing distress in the life of the accused because the false accusation devises destruction. Furthermore, David helps us to see here that the tongue that spreads a false accusation ends up causing distress in the life of the accused because that tongue is like a razor sharp, it's a sharp razor that works deceitfully. Finally, David reveals here that the tongue that spreads a false accusation ends up causing distress in the life of the accused because a deceitful tongue is producing words that devour, or in other words, words that ruin and destroy the life of the one being accused. From this, we must understand then that false accusations, they not only distort reality, they not only damage reputations, they not only destroy families, but false accusations cause distress in the life of the one who has been falsely accused. And when we decide to go and post something on our Facebook, an accusation against another person that might be false, when we send out a mass email, when we spread slanderous gossip throughout the church, false accusations, we are just causing distress in the life of that person that's being falsely accused. And so we have to be careful not to do this, not to have that sharp razor tongue that's working deceit. The fact is, we could all wish to avoid the sort of distress that comes from being falsely accused. I mean, nobody wants to be falsely accused. But that's not what our study is about. Our study isn't about how to deal with people who falsely accuse us. But rather, what we're considering here is becoming Christians who avoid spreading the slanderous speech of false accusations. Christian, listen, we all face opportunities to receive and repeat false accusations that other careless people choose to spread. Therefore, before you decide to become a talebearer and spread the slanderous speech that you received from another person, I would encourage you to double check the information just to make sure that you aren't spreading false accusations. Because listen, false accusations will always bear bad fruit in the lives of those who are falsely accused. And so I encourage you to avoid the bad fruit of false accusations by always speaking the truth in love.